16, which is the endocrine system. And in many ways, chapter 16 is sort of the continuation of what we were doing in A&P1 before the break. And that is command and control. We were talking about the nervous system. So there's the central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, which controls many of the automatic or physiologic functions of the body. And in many ways, the endocrine system is an extension of the central nervous system. This system operates by the use of chemical messengers, chemicals that are released in one part of the body that have effects on cells at a distant part of the body. Why do we have these command and control systems? The body has to intelligently respond to change. Homeostasis is the body keeping itself alive, keeping itself stable, within its normal ranges. Well, in order to accomplish that, different parts of the body have to interact and they have to cooperate. So we have a nervous system and we have an endocrine system to allow for homeostasis so that one part of the body can affect another part of the body. All right? So essentially there are 4 ways that cells can communicate with each other. And communication is necessary in order to coordinate activities and to have multiple cells all working together in a coordinated fashion. All right, so the first mechanism is what we call direct communication. And this is where cells can talk directly, one cell to another, through gap junctions. So what's a gap junction? Whoops, didn't mean to go forward. If you remember, we talked a little bit about them last semester. But if this is one cell and this is another, a gap junction is kind of like a straw, like a drinking straw, that goes from the inside of one cell to the inside of another. And what these gap junctions allow is they allow molecules to go directly from one cell to another. So where we really see these used is in like ions. So let's say you've got a sodium ion. It can travel from this cell's cytoplasm directly to its neighbor through these drinking straw-like gap junctions. All right? We see these, this communication system particularly in smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. Smooth muscle cells all have to contract together in order to do their job. Heart muscle, same thing. If the cells aren't all contracting at once, you're going to have a problem with, creating pressure. So direct communication happens through these gap junctions, and it allows very rapid coordination of cells. The problem is it can't travel very far. The cells have to be in physical contact with one another for this direct communication to work. All right, so that's one type. The next is paracrine communication. This is where cells talk to neighboring cells, not directly like in the gap junctions, but using chemicals released from one cell that travel through the interstitial fluid. So in a typical tissue, you're going to have multiple cells in sort of a solution called interstitial fluid. Let's see. So you have a collection of cells. Cells, very rarely do you find just one, right? So in paracrine communication, this cell right here, it might release a chemical mediator that affects, these cells here. So the neighbors, in a sense. Paracrine communication is also limited by distance. This is just one cell, and it isn't a cell that's specialized for creating hormones or chemical messengers. So it can't make very much chemical, and the chemical can't go very far. So paracrine communication only affects things locally. Probably the place you see this effect at its biggest in what is inflammation. And that is anytime there's damage or injury to a cell, it releases some chemicals that cause changes to the local environment. So you stepped in a hole and you twisted your ankle, and the next day it's all red and swollen, right? Well, that's the result of paracrine communication. The damaged ligament cells released chemical messengers that affected the capillaries and the blood vessels in that ankle and caused that swelling and that warmth and the pain as well. So paracrine is cell to cell, but it doesn't go through the bloodstream. You'll notice that there's no vessel required here. It's just a local effect. All right, and then endocrine communication, which is what this chapter is all about. This is where cells release their chemical messengers into the bloodstream. The blood carries that chemical messenger all over the body, and then it has its effects anywhere that there is a target cell that has a receptor. So one of the themes of the endocrine system is all the cells of the body are exposed to all of the chemical messengers that are being circulated. But the only way that a cell can respond to a chemical messenger is if it has a receptor. In other words, it has to have some way of seeing, so to speak, that chemical in order for any kind of change to occur. And we'll talk more about that later. Okay. And then the last way of cells communicating is by synaptic communication. This we already talked about. We talked about that last semester. That action potential propagates down that axon, and then once it gets to the end, neurotransmitter is released across that gap, and those neurotransmitters then affect the next cell in the chain in that nervous system or nerve circuit. So we call that synaptic communication. Technically speaking, synaptic communication is a form of paracrine communication, but because it's so highly advanced, it sort of gets its own name. So it's this one that we're going to talk most about here in this chapter, and that is cells communicating with other cells using chemical messengers released into the bloodstream, circulated around the body, and then affecting cells that have receptors. All right. So even though there are a wide range of hormones in the body, they all sort of fall into three general categories. So we can simplify and organize our thinking about these chemical messengers by sort of looking at these three big category types. All right. So we have amino, and what we're talking about here is the messengers themselves. In other words, the chemicals that are going to be released from one cell and have effects on another cell. All right, so first up are the amino acid derivatives. Amino acids, are the building blocks of proteins, right? And there is a wide variety of chemicals that make up this group of amino acids. Amino acids really have a lot of diversity in terms of chemistry and chemical properties. So some of the amino acid derivatives, so this class of hormones starts with an amino acid that's modified slightly, and then the body uses that as a messenger. So the thyroid hormones, which we're going to talk more about either today, probably tomorrow, or not tomorrow, but on Monday. It starts with an amino acid, and then it gets iodines added to it. So do you see these I's? You don't see that in chemical formulas very often because iodine is a great big huge atom. But for the thyroid hormones, we start with a amino acid, we add iodine to it, and then it becomes thyroxine. Another group is the catecholamines. Catecholamines get a lot of attention because they're the fight or flight chemicals. So epinephrine and norepinephrine, also called adrenaline and noradrenaline, they are actually amino acid derivatives. So they began their existence as amino acids, and then the cells that released them modified those amino acids to create the catecholamines. All right, so that's an amino acid derivative. And then melatonin, which is important in the sleep-wake cycle, it starts its life as tryptophan. And tryptophan is an amino acid as well. So you can see that melatonin is sort of a complicated molecule, and it never in my class do you ever have to memorize chemical formulas. This is not a chemistry class, but you can just sort of see that melatonin is sort of a complicated molecule. All right, so the amino acid derivatives. The peptide hormones. A peptide is just a small protein, okay? Proteins are long strings of amino acids twisted and bent into particular shapes, right? Well, peptides are small chains of amino acids, and the body uses some peptide chains as chemical messengers. So, for example, thyroid-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, these are all peptide hormones. In other words, they're tiny little proteins, essentially, that trigger the receptor mechanisms. All right. So for the amino acid derivatives and the peptide hormones, these are water-soluble. In other words, they cannot pass through cell membranes. Remember that cell membranes, because they have a lipid center, water-soluble molecules can't get through. You have to have a transporter of some kind to get it from the outside to the inside. So for the amino acid derivatives and the peptide hormones, the body or the cell, in order to be affected, the cell is going to have a receptor, right? So, here's our cell, and here's our amino acid derivatives, let's say, the asterisks. They can't get from outside to inside. Here's the nucleus, right? Because they can't pass through the cell membrane without some help. So what the body does is, rather than having these hormones come in, the cell puts a receptor on the surface. So this is kind of like a mailbox. And this is the mail, so to speak. So these chemical messengers have to arrive at the receptor, bind, and then on the inside, changes will happen, which we'll talk about in a minute. So that's a receptor system. If there's no receptor on a cell, then this chemical messenger can have no effect on that cell, right? Because without the receptor, the activator, so to speak, the mailbox, the message isn't received. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay. So then the final class of chemical messengers are the lipid derivatives. And you might imagine that since these are derived from lipid, that they might be lipid soluble, and they are. So the big difference between these two and this one is the lipid derivatives can pass right from the bloodstream, right through the membrane, and directly into the nucleus. So because these lipid derivatives are lipid soluble, they can, without a receptor, they can just zoop, go right into the cell because they can pass through membranes. So some examples of those, there's really two big classes. There's the eicosanoids, which is a hard word to say. The eicosanoids are sort of complex molecules. The ones that are most important are the prostaglandins and the leukotrienes. Now, we're not going to talk very much about this class. Where you see these play a major role is in the immune system. In order to create a coordinated attack on a pathogen, the immune system has to communicate with the cells of the immune system have to communicate with each other. And the eicosanoids are a big class that works in that. But for this chapter, we're not going to discuss these very much. Okay, so that's one group. A much more commonly referred to group is the steroid hormones. Now, the steroid hormones actually start their life as cholesterol, which is a lipid that has kind of this complex ring structure that you see here. But the cholesterol is modified to become the steroid hormones. These are hormones that you've heard of. So estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, cortisol, those are all steroid hormones. And the reason that these molecules make very good chemical messengers is because they can pass through cell membranes. What we'll see is that for the lipid derivatives, the most common mechanism of action is it makes its way into the nucleus and then causes some change in transcription. In other words, it turns genes on and off. And it can do that, the steroid hormones can do that because they can pass through cell membranes. All right? So 3 main classes of chemical messengers: the amino acid derivatives, the peptide hormones, the lipid derivatives. These top 2 are water soluble, so they need receptors to work. And these 2 are lipid soluble, so the receptors that make these function can be on the inside of cells, not necessarily on the outside. All right. So those are the chemical messengers. Now, how about the organs that make and use them? Okay, so we're going to start here, the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the control center for the endocrine system. And in many ways, the hypothalamus is the bridge between the brain and the endocrine system. The brain coordinates everything the body does. And these chemical messengers and their effects, they have to be coordinated too. So the hypothalamus is the extension of the brain that then controls the rest of this system, the rest of the endocrine system. All right, so hypothalamus. The pituitary gland, if the hypothalamus is the brain of the system, the pituitary gland is the workhorse, okay? Because it is going to create and release most of the hormones in the endocrine system, okay? And we're going to talk extensively here in a little while about the pituitary gland and what it actually does. So we have multiple hormones. Hypothalamus controls, pituitary releases. All right. And then around the body, we have some targets. The pituitary gland releases hormones. Those hormones make other hormones happen, so to speak. So the thyroid gland, for example, is found in the neck. And it releases thyroid hormone in response to thyroid-stimulating hormone from the pituitary gland. So just an example, and we'll look at these in much more detail here in a little while. All right, so thyroid gland. The adrenal glands. Okay, these we've already talked a little bit about, right? When we talked about the sympathetic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys like little top hats, like little pointy hats, and they release hormones. So the hormones they're most famous for are the adrenaline and noradrenaline that comes about from a fight or flight response. You're startled or you're scared, and the adrenal glands dump a bunch of adrenaline into your bloodstream so you're ready to fight or flee. Well, the adrenal glands release some other hormones as well. Hormones that have to do with growth, water and salt balance, as well as the sympathetic nervous system like you already know about. So the adrenal glands. The pancreas. The pancreas is technically a digestive system organ because it releases enzymes that help us digest our food. But the pancreas also has some very important endocrine functions as well. So many of you will have already heard that insulin, which is a hormone that controls glucose level, it's produced by the pancreas. But in addition, there's also another hormone produced by the pancreas that kind of works in the opposite way of insulin, and that's called glucagon. So we'll talk a little bit about the pancreas and what it makes. The pineal gland is found at the base of the brain. It's a little tiny, tiny thing, but it produces melatonin. And melatonin, despite having been pretty well studied, we're still not exactly sure what melatonin does. We know it has something to do with our circadian rhythms or our sleep-wake cycles. Because a person with a damaged pineal gland has problems with sleep, getting to sleep, waking up on time, feeling refreshed, all those things. So for now, just know that the pineal gland produces melatonin. And it produces melatonin in response to a hormone from the pituitary gland called melatonin-releasing hormone. All right. pineal gland, parathyroid glands. So we have the thyroid that produces thyroid hormone. Well, the parathyroid glands produce, not surprisingly, parathyroid hormone, which you've actually already heard a little about. If you remember last semester, we talked about bones and how calcium is put into the bones and calcium is taken out as the body needs it. Well, parathyroid hormone is a part of that calcium regulation system, all right? And it's controlled by the pituitary gland as well as calcium levels. All right, so in purple here are the primary endocrine glands. Now, these are organs whose principal job really is to produce chemical messengers. Now, there's a whole other list of organs that have endocrine function, but are primarily something, their primary functions are something else. Okay, so for example, the heart, primary function is pump blood around, but it also releases some chemical messengers that play a role in the regulation of blood volume. And those are the natriuretic peptides, which we'll talk extensively about in Unit 3 when we finally get there. So the heart has endocrine function. The thymus gland, which is an important immune system organ, it also releases some hormones that coordinate and stimulate the immune system. So some of those eicosanoids are produced by the thymus. So it has an endocrine function. The digestive tract, primary function is to absorb nutrients, right? But it also releases a number of hormones to control itself, as well as to control the body's overall metabolism. So when we get to the digestive tract, we'll talk a little bit about some of those hormones, like gastrin and secretin and cholecystokinin. But we won't talk much about those in this chapter. So all of this box right here, we're going to talk more about these in other chapters. There's still endocrine components. We're just going to talk about them later, as opposed to talking about all the hormones in this one chapter, which will get very confusing. All right. So digestive tract. The kidneys, their primary job is to control our fluid balance and to get rid of waste products. But the kidneys also have some endocrine function as well. They release chemical messengers that control the formation of red blood cells. They also release hormone called renin, which controls blood pressure and blood volume. So the kidneys have chemical messengers that they make. And then finally the gonads. The principal point of the gonad is to produce a gamete, either sperm or an egg, half the genetic material ready to come together with another half. But the gonads also have important endocrine functions too. So like the ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone, and the testes produce testosterone. So we're going to talk about those endocrine functions when we get to the reproductive system at the end of the course. All right, so we've got our primary endocrine organs, and then organs that have secondary endocrine functions. So these guys we're going to talk about in this chapter. These we're going to learn more about later. All right. Okay, so the book sort of starts complicated and then gets simpler, which is not always the best path, but that's what we have to go with. So we have our chemical messengers, right? They've been released by one of those glands that we just talked about. So maybe the hypothalamus, maybe the pituitary, maybe the thyroid gland, whatever. So the chemical messengers appear in the bloodstream. So the blood goes everywhere, and the chemical messengers go wherever the blood goes, okay? But not all cells in the body need to respond to all chemical messengers, right? Your skin cells, for example, they don't need to respond to, let's pick one, to adrenaline necessarily, because they can't make a response that's going to matter, okay? So in order for a cell to respond to the chemical messengers that are present, it has to have a receptor on its membrane. So what is a receptor? We talked about this word a little bit last time, but the easiest way to think of it is as kind of a little machine, or a little, like almost a Lego model. All right, so here's our hormone. Here's our chemical messenger, right? Might be an amino acid derivative, might be a peptide hormone. It has a shape, right? Because all molecules have a shape. Well, the receptor is a protein also that's embedded in the cell membrane that has a complementary shape. So if you think about Lego blocks, the top of the block and the bottom of the block are complementary. They fit together, right? That's why they were created like that. Well, these receptors do the same thing with these hormones. They sort of fit, that chemical messenger fits into that receptor. And when it does so when it goes click and they attach here, it creates a subtle change in this receptor on the inside. Now, how that works is some pretty complicated chemistry, but it is sort of cool. So a hormone attaches on the outside, but it causes a change to this receptor, which means that now on the inside, a signal can be received. So even though this hormone never entered the cell, it can make a change inside the cell, because as the hormone binds, the receptor changes, and as the receptor changes, then something can change on the inside. All right? So these couple of slides are talking about some of the mechanisms by which the inside is changed by the outside. That was some of the outside thing? Yeah, okay. All right, so two examples. So this mechanism is what we call a second messenger. Why a second? Well, the first messenger is the hormone itself, right? Because essentially the hormone is carrying a message. It's carrying a message from some gland. So let's say that it's from the thyroid gland. So this is thyroid hormone. Typically, the message that thyroid hormone means to a cell is speed up, do more, use more energy. All right, so hormone clicks into place. The receptor makes a subtle change. That subtle change activates an attached protein called a G protein. All right? So once that G protein is activated, it can do something. So in this case here, we'll look at this example right here. So the hormone attaches, the receptor changes, which activates this G protein. Once this G protein is activated, it starts doing something. What is it doing? It's going to turn ATP, which we know and love, right, into cyclic AMP. So what is that? Well, remember that ATP is sort of a long molecule, because it's an adenosine, and then it has phosphates attached. Well, what cyclic AMP is it sort of takes this and turns it into a circle. So it attaches the phosphates around the corner. So we would call this one, well, in this case, cyclic EMP. So the hormone, the first messenger, the hormone from the bloodstream, has caused an increase in a second messenger, in this case, cyclic AMP. That's a signal, right? Even though the hormone hasn't come in the cell, as hormone attaches to the cell membrane, because of this reaction, cyclic AMP concentrations go up, and that can then cause other things to happen. So we get this kind of cascade effect. So hormone attaches, G protein is activated, ATP becomes cyclic AMP, and then cyclic AMP triggers some change. It might be ion channels opening, enzymes activating. So because this hormone has attached to the cell has changed its behavior, right? Which is the whole point of the endocrine system. So that's one example. Another example sort of goes in reverse. And that is a G protein activation can reduce the amount of cyclic AMP as well. So in this case, cyclic AMP levels go up. In this case, cyclic AMP levels go down because it's being turned back into the straight form, right? So this would be stimulatory because the first messenger causes an increase in the second messenger, and then the second messenger causes things to happen. This would be inhibitory. The first messenger causes a decrease in the second messenger, which in this case is cyclic AMP. So that's going to reduce the activation of enzymes. So it's going to sort of turn that cell down. So this is one second messenger system using cyclic AMP as that second messenger. Another example, it uses calcium as the second messenger. So here, hormone binds, protein receptor changes a little, the G protein is activated, and in this case, now the G protein, instead of affecting cyclic AMP, it's going to open calcium channels. So calcium levels are going to go up, and then once calcium levels go up, that can make things happen. So let's say that this was a smooth muscle cell, right? Hormone attaches like ADH, and the G protein is activated, calcium comes in. As calcium levels in a smooth muscle cell go up, it starts to contract, right? So a signal from the outside has created a change on the inside using a second messenger. So one messenger on the outside, one messenger on the inside. So very common mechanism, particularly for the amino acid derivatives and the peptide hormones, is for the message on the outside to trigger a message on the inside, essentially. All right? But you'll notice that the hormone never enters the cell. So it's all triggered by the receptor, which then activates the protein, which then does something. All right. So that's one. Another mechanism of effect commonly seen in the steroids is to have an effect at the nucleus. Now, steroid hormones can make this trick happen because they can pass through cell membranes without a need for a receptor. This would never work for the amino acid derivatives or the peptide hormones because they can't get in. But here, this mechanism is much simpler. So the steroid hormone is released. Let's say this is estrogen from the ovary, right? And it's going to enter the cell because it can do that. And it may find a receptor in one of two places. It may be in the cytoplasm, where once this steroid has bound to the receptor, this complex can go on to make something happen. Or the receptor may be in the nucleus itself. Now, typically, what steroid hormones do is they turn genes on and off. So you know that you have your 23 pairs of chromosomes, right? And those chromosomes are huge long strings of DNA. Well, with thousands and thousands and thousands of different genes, right? Well, not all the genes are on all the time. For example, you've got a skin cell and you've got a liver cell. They have two very different functions. Their structures are different. Pretty much everything about them is different. The reason for that is because the skin cell has one set of genes that are on, and the liver cell has another set of genes that are on. Well, steroid receptors, together with their steroid molecule, can trigger a change in which genes are turned on. So we can have either an increase in turning a gene on, or we can have turning a gene off. If we turn a gene on, we're going to get a change in which proteins are made, and that's going to affect what the cell does. So one of the reasons that the nucleus is considered the control center for the cell is because it's inside the nucleus that the determination is made of which genes are going to be on and which genes are going to be off. So very common mechanism of effect of the steroids is to trigger a change in gene activation. So this one right here. Once the gene is activated, then it's going to get transcribed into a protein. Different translation of different proteins is going to result in a different cellular activity. All right. And then the last one that the book points out, the last mechanism. And what these are, these last three slides, this is how these chemical messengers actually do anything. The biomechanics or the machinery that makes, how do you turn a chemical messenger in the cytoplasm into a change in a cell's behavior, all right? So one was that secondary messenger system. The second one was turning genes on and off inside the nucleus. And this one is a third one. And this is called the intracellular receptor. In this case, the hormone actually does enter the cell, but it needs a transporter or a system for gaining access to the inside of the cell. So thyroid hormone, for example, it may bind to the surface and then it gets shuttled inside. So instead of staying on the outside like we saw with the second messenger system, in this case the chemical messenger is brought inside the cell. And then inside the cell it finds receptors at different organelles. So for example, the mitochondria have receptors for thyroid hormone. You know, the mitochondria produce energy, right? And the thyroid gland controls the energy output of the body. So let's say it's it's winter is coming, it's getting colder and colder. Well, one of the body's responses to that is to increase thyroid hormone levels to basically turn the thermostat of the body up so that the mitochondria use more energy to produce more heat. So as thyroid hormone encounters these receptors on the mitochondria then are affected by that. So that's one example. There is also receptors in the nucleus for thyroid hormone. So once it has gotten into the cell, we have two different sites of effect. We have at the mitochondria, and then we have, there's that sound I told you about. See? It happens about once an hour, but it doesn't do any harm. It's just blowing off pressure. All right, mitochondria, and then in the nucleus, same thing as the steroid hormones. Thyroid hormone together with its receptor can turn genes on and off too. So it can get a cell to trigger into mitosis or cell division. It can turn a cell up or down, essentially. So these are intracellular receptors. So we had three mechanisms of effect. Second messenger, where the first messenger attaches at the cell membrane, which causes some change to the level of a second messenger on the inside. The steroids pass right into the nucleus and then turn genes on or off. And then the intracellular receptors, a hormone is transported into the cell, and then inside the cell there are receptors that make change happen, either at the mitochondria or at the nucleus. All right. Okay, so the hypothalamus. So those are mechanisms of chemical effect. In other words, at the target organ, we'll see mechanisms like that making cells change their behavior. Okay, so a little shift of gears. So that's sort of the down and dirty how it works on the inside of the target cell. Now we're going to back up and we're going to look at the endocrine system itself. So where do these chemical messengers come from? If that's how they work, those mechanisms, how do they come about? And it really all begins with the hypothalamus. So just to remind you, the hypothalamus is a region of the brain. It's found very deep and low down in the brain. So, here's the brain in cross-section. Here's the cerebral cortex. Here's the cerebellum. Here's the brainstem. Well, the hypothalamus is found sort of at the base of the brain, in one of the oldest parts of the brain evolutionarily. In other words, long before there was fancy, logic and creative thought, hypothalamus still exists. Even like worms have hypothalamus. So very evolutionary old part of the brain. And the hypothalamus is what controls the endocrine system. And it does that in really three ways. So these are the three ways that the hypothalamus controls the rest of the system. One is by directly releasing hormones. So there are nerve cells where the cell bodies are here in the hypothalamus. Their axons go down into the pituitary. We're going to talk more about that later. And these axons of these neurons directly release two hormones into the bloodstream. And that's ADH and oxytocin. All right, so what you're going to see in this chapter is all of the hormones have abbreviations. They are sort of worth learning, not just so you don't have to write as much, but they are very frequently used, these abbreviations. So we have our first two hormones. Okay, so ADH and oxytocin. ADH, anti-diuretic hormone. Okay, so what do those words mean? Well, a diuretic is a medication that increases urine output, right? The most common one in the world is Lasix. Well, if a diuretic makes you pee a lot, what does an anti-diuretic do? Just the opposite. It reduces your urine output. So ADH reduces urine output. It's the desert hormone, so to speak. If you're trapped in the desert and you want to hold on to all the water that you can, well, you don't want to be making urine, right? You want to hold on to that water. So whenever you're dehydrated or dry, ADH is released, which causes a decrease in urine output. We're going to see exactly how that works in Unit 3 when we talk about the urinary system. But for now, for today, the important bit is that ADH is released from the posterior part of the pituitary, and it is technically released from neurons that originate in the hypothalamus. All right, so that's one, ADH. The other, OXT, is oxytocin. And oxytocin has two principal effects. One is to coordinate the contraction of the uterus during childbirth, and the other is to cause letdown in the mammary glands. So oxytocin is sort of a reproductive system hormone, and it too is released from the posterior pituitary. If you've ever been a part of an augmented or triggered labor, we can synthesize oxytocin, and then we call it pitocin. So if you've ever heard of pitocin, that's synthetic oxytocin. All right. So that's our first two hormones. There's going to get to be a lot more, don't worry. Okay, so that's one way. Hypothalamus releases oxytocin and ADH from the posterior pituitary. All right. The next way the hypothalamus controls the system and makes things happen is through regulatory hormones. These are chemical messengers that are released from here, travel down, and have effects here. Not a very long path, right? And in some ways, it's sort of silly that the brain does it that way, but evolution doesn't make everything beautiful and intelligent and efficient. So the hypothalamus produces chemical messengers. They travel this very short distance, and they trigger the release of different hormones than from the anterior pituitary. All right? And then the last way that the hypothalamus controls the endocrine system is through nerves. The hypothalamus has nerves that go out to the adrenal gland, and then in the adrenal gland, it can stimulate the production and release of adrenaline and noradrenaline, so epinephrine and norepinephrine. So the hypothalamus controls things in three ways: direct release, the release of releasing hormones or regulatory hormones, and then the connection to the adrenal glands, which can trigger release of hormones there. All right. All right, so let's zoom in. So if one of those, let's back up for a second. So this is two hormones, right? This is really two hormones, norepinephrine and epinephrine. But this middle box, the regulatory hormones, you're going to see that it's like 10 or 11 different hormones. Okay, so we're going to spend most of our time talking about this piece of how the hypothalamus controls things. So if the hypothalamus, that's here, if it's going to release chemical messengers that are going to cause a change here, well, there needs to be a blood vessel system connecting the two things, right? And we call this the hypophyseal portal system. Why on earth would you call it that? Okay, well, this little stalk here, this thing that hangs down, which we call the pituitary gland, it used to be called the hypophysis. Hypo is below, physis is this region of the brain. So the hypophysis hypophysis or hypophyseal is this area right here. So whenever you see the pituitary gland, you're going to see it sort of divided into two parts. All right, so this whole thing is the pituitary. This is the back, and this is the front. So the posterior pituitary, you see this line down the middle right here? The posterior pituitary is this part that produces ADH and oxytocin. And it's called the neurohypophysis. Why? Because this is all nervous tissue back here. It is the axons of the cell bodies that have come from the hypothalamus above. They travel down through the stalk and then are here. It's the anterior pituitary where things are the most complicated, right? The posterior pituitary produces just two hormones, those two. The anterior pituitary produces like 12 hormones. So we have a lot more complexity there. So the hypothalamus releases chemical messengers which travel through this blood system, arrive at the anterior pituitary, and then trigger the anterior pituitary cells to release hormones of different types. And then the hormones that the anterior pituitary releases then go out into the body and usually trigger the release of another hormone. So we have this sort of chain of events where the hypothalamus releases a messenger, which gets the pituitary to release a messenger, which gets a gland to release a messenger, which then that messenger has effects on the body. All right? And we're going to look at some of those systems next time because we're about out of time for today. All right, so sort of the general approach is the brain controls the limbic system, which is part of the brain. The limbic system controls the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus controls the pituitary, and then the pituitary triggers target glands, the target organs. All right? So we call this blood vessel system the portal system because a portal system is any place you have blood going from artery to vein that's passing through two capillary beds in between. We call that a portal system. So blood comes in, a capillary bed forms, right? The capillaries come back together through these veins right here. Another capillary bed forms, and then it goes back out to the circulation. So because the hypothalamus is going to control the anterior pituitary, we need to have this nice, rich blood supply so that the messenger can get from point A to point B. All right? And we're going to call it there for today, and we'll continue on with talking about the pituitary next time. All right? We didn't get to any questions today. Wow, that really flew.